All right, so let's move quite along. So the early Chu culture, or the Shang Dynasty, is going to be replaced, or I guess succeeded by is a better word than replaced. We'll go with succeeded by the Shang Dynasty. And so it's really in this lecture that we're going to be talking about a lot of the traits of classic Chinese civilization. But again, to it's so hard to condense all of this down. So we're just going to be doing broad strokes. This is an intro class. We don't have to know all the details. And so that's what we're going to really be focusing on. So the Shang Dynasty, which you can see here is the second major dynasty, is also known as the early Kang phase of Chinese prehistory, if you'd rather talk about it in that. It's kind of like how you can say Xia or early Chu. You can say early Kang or Shang Dynasty. And this period is probably best documented by the site of Zhangzhou. And so that's what we're going to talk about. I really want to focus on sites because sometimes sites are just really good illustrations of what a period felt and looked like. And so that's why I like to focus on sites a lot of the times. So Zhangzhou is a rectangular arrangement of buildings surrounded by a pounded earth wall. So essentially we have a bunch of residences and other buildings that's surrounded by a large earthen defensive structure. And this city has pretty much anything you would expect of an ancient prehistoric urban center. There are residential areas, but also ceremonial centers that are the domain of the ruling elites. It's surrounded by thousands of pit houses and animal pens and shops and storage pits, everything that you would picture of like a pre-industrial city. The important thing here is that these are not Neolithic times anymore. Like, this is civilization. This is China. It is not the small little quaint agricultural village anymore. Zhangzhou would have been occupied by hundreds of skilled full-time craftspeople. And we see this in the archaeological record, where if you excavated a site like this, you were just constantly pulling shit out of the ground. We have, and just the artifactual assemblages that survived, we have hundreds of animal bones that are fashioned into fish hooks, awls, axes, and hairpins. We found more than a dozen pottery kilns from this city. We found metalsmith workshops where they did the mass production of bronze objects. Again, these are things that we're looking for when we think about civilization. We're looking for full-time occupational craftspeople. We found that here at the site of Zhangzhou. So let's take a minute and talk a little bit about bronze working. We'll talk a little bit about metal when we talk about Europe as well, but I want to take a pause in our kind of movement through Chinese prehistory just to talk a little bit about metal, because metal is really important and it's going to replace stone as one of the dominant materials that people are making objects out of. So bronze first appears in Southeast Asia by about 4500 BC, but we don't really know much about these early Asian bronze working cultures. We tend to find the earliest evidence of bronze in very small sites that don't have a lot of other things with them. So we know that people were using bronze at this early time, but we don't really know who they were, what other aspects of their culture that they were. Bronze is going to be used first in Southeast Asia, because this is where most of your copper and tin deposits are going to be. And bronze is when you mix copper and tin, and that's what you get. You get an alloy called bronze. And so because people in Southeast Asia were located so closely to these copper and tin deposits, that's where mostly you're going to be getting people using it. It's important to recognize, though, that in its very early days, as bronze works its way north into China, that the Chinese don't really see this as much of a technological advance, but instead they're more interested in it as a stylistic advance. That is, that they're more interested in making things out of bronze that are lovely and pretty to look at, not really for utilitarian purposes. They're not using it for cooking. They're still going to focus mostly with clay and pottery for that. For the most part, especially in the early periods, they're not going to use it much for warfare. They are eventually going to use it for warfare, but not in this early period. They're not using it to cut down trees or do pretty much anything for agricultural tasks, they're still going to use stone for that. Instead, bronze is something you use and you own because it's pretty. It's going to be, for them, it's going to be considered a luxury item. It's what you use if you're rich and wealthy and powerful. You start to display that you have bronze. If you're one of the peasantry, if you're one of the lower classes, you're not going to have bronze items. You have clay, you have stone, you're going to keep using what you've used for a long time. Eventually, bronze is going to start working its way down and becoming more of a utilitarian thing. But at first, it's a stylistic advance. It's a way to differentiate yourself and your place in society because of how pretty it looks, not because of how useful it is to do your tasks that you have to do as you work through the day. So let's move on a little bit about Shang agriculture. This is another thing that we're not necessarily seeing too many differences in. The agriculture during the Shang Dynasty looks kind of similar to what agriculture has been looking like since the Neolithic in China, just more intensified. There's still millet, wheat, rice, and vegetables, cattle, sheep, and pigs, introducing things like the domesticated water buffalo. But I mean, looks to me pretty much like domesticated crops we found in Neolithic China. Not, it's just now they're doing more of it because they have to feed more people. One thing one thing to notice though is that before, if you remember back in Neolithic China, I talked about how popular millet was and that millet was the dominant Chinese crop. What we're seeing now is that wheat and rice are becoming much more common and that their influence and their spread is becoming much more expansive. I know that was a shitty sentence, but I hope you get what I mean. Sorry, I've been recording all day trying to re-record these for you guys. So my brain is a little all over the place. But we're not really seeing agriculturally anything that we saw like in Egypt or Mesopotamia or the Harappans. They're not doing large scale irrigation systems. Even at this very civilized, very complex part of their prehistory, they're still doing a lot of hunting and gathering. So agriculturally, the complex Shang period doesn't look much different than before. Politically, also, if you're a commoner, you're probably living very similarly to your Neolithic Yangshao ancestors. You're probably living in a smallish village, living in a pit house, probably along a river system. You're subsisting along the same kinds of crops and using the same kinds of agricultural technology as your ancestors did. You're pretty much doing what they did, not major changes. So for most people, the introduction of this kind of complex civilization isn't going to make any impact on their lives. The only people it's really impacting are the people who are quickly attaining power and the people who are moving into the urban centers because they're specialized artisans of some kind of craft. But for most people in China, you're going to live in a rural agricultural village that looks very similar to the Neolithic. The changes that we do see happening are in these urban centers, where now, though, you do have a government that's headed by a king or an emperor, whatever you want to call them, and that this king, this ruler, is considered to have supernatural powers that gives them their right to rule and gives them superiority over all other aspects or other people living in ancient China. And China at this time definitely sees itself as being the center of the universe, and that they see themselves as being surrounded by rings of barbarians, of less civilized people than them, but they see themselves as being the center of the entire universe. And at the center of the center is the king. And the king not only has supernatural powers, but has the ability to rule through both force and diplomacy. So the king attains their power through this ideology. It's a coercive socio-political elite that's founded on ideological principles. We've talked about this a lot and its importance to civilization. But if you needed to, the king could command quite a big army to march on your village or whatever and fuck you up if they needed to, right? Because the king has this supernatural power, but also has direct, violent force power. And the king because of this, can do a lot of things. The king organizes labor and can conscript commoners into doing public works or into doing military service. The king also has a complex hierarchy of nobles. And yes, these nobles had considerable local autonomy in their respective territories, but were still answerable to the king of China. And the king actually had a really great system, and this does mimic feudalism in Europe in a lot of ways, in that while the nobles were in charge of defending their homeland, they also had to supply their people for warfare and public works, and they had to collect taxes. So what all of this means is that while the nobles had local autonomy and control over their respective territories, if there were people who were trying to invade that land, the king kind of was like, that's your job. You're the noble. When the king wanted people because the king wanted more for his army or wanted public works made in his name, the nobles were responsible for supplying those peasants. When the king needed money, the nobles were in charge of collecting taxes from their peasants. So the nobles had a lot of power, but they were also very much answerable to the king. And this all gets us back to some things that I've been mentioning, which is that this is the first time we're going to see large-scale warfare in China, and the king not only had the ability to build up significant armies, but also use them. We see royal armies of up to 30,000 people at this period in China, which I know today when we look at the military-industrial complex doesn't look like a lot, but for this period was quite a lot. And the basis for the army was this horse-drawn carriage, chariots drawn by infantrymen, mostly using bone or wood for their weapons. Later, by the end of the Shang Dynasty, going to start using bronze. But remember, bronze in the early days was more of a stylistic thing, not really a technological thing. And this is kind of an issue. I mean, the thing is that well, we're also yeah, warfare, and we kind of glorify warfare in many ways in our modern day, and we're like, oh yeah, now we've gotten to complex society, they can build armies. On the downside, this led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people in China. And China's not the only one with warfare. The Sumerians are going to go to war. The Egyptians go to war. The Harappans really don't. They just kind of get invaded. The Europeans, we know the Roman army. So this isn't oh, the Chinese suck. They're the ones who are violent in warfare. Everybody does this. Warfare just appears in a very complex form much earlier in China than it does in other places. But we're going to see a lot of death because of warfare, a lot of prisoners being taken, a lot of people being sacrificed and enslaved. Yeah, warfare, not so pretty. Archaeologically, in addition to the weaponry and the chariots and the dead bodies, we're also going to find that because of warfare, we're going to start to see an increase in the amount of defensive structures in a lot of Chinese towns and villages. And as the Shang Dynasty moves, people are going to start moving out of these smaller villages and into more larger villages and cities because those larger urban areas are easier to defend. However, I do want to say that China in general is much less urbanized than Mesopotamia, Egypt, or as we'll see later, Mesoamerica. While China has some large cities, the Chinese Empire is relatively spread out. People live in their small little villages, in their small little agricultural rural areas. A lesser percentage of the people are living in cities than in these other major world centers. So as people do move into these kind of semi-urban settings, these aren't like the cities that we were seeing in a lot of other places. They had few cities. These are the places where the elites lived, nowhere really else. The Chinese are also quite famous for their writing system. Writing in China evolved quite rapidly around 1200 BC, and originally had about 3,000 phonetic, ideographic, or pictographic characters. So a lot to learn, was very difficult, if not impossible to memorize. And we actually don't know what most of these mean. If we're looking at this very early Chinese, we've only translated about a third of these characters. So we can read some of this early works, but a lot of it we just can't. And they were doing a lot with writing, probably again, like most early writing forms, probably for economic and administrative or bureaucratic purposes. But some things that we find that are really cool is we find like 160,000 inscribed shells from this period, most of which have not been translated. So we don't really know the purpose of most of these, but pretty cool. And they were also doing a lot of writing on things like bronze and stone and things like that. But that's all I've got for you for this lecture. We've got one more lecture and then we're gonna just wrap up ancient China, but some really cool things going on. So yeah, we're almost done.